I'm Kyle Cleveland with TUJ's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. We have with us today Anthony DaCosta. He is an eminent scholar in global studies and a professor of economics in the College of Business at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Professor Acosta is a scholar in global studies and a professor of economics. He was the chair and professor of contemporary Indian studies and director of development studies at the University of Melbourne, and research director in A.P. Moller-Maersk, professor of Indian studies at the Copenhagen Business School. He was a professor of comparative international development at the University of Washington for 18 years, and his second home is in Seattle, he was telling me. His most recent books are The Changing Context and Shifting Roles of the Indian State, New Perspectives on Development Dynamics, and The Last Question in India, State, Dispossession, Capitalist Transition. He's previously a Fulbright scholar, and also as an Abe Fellowship scholar, he wrote International Mobility, Global Capitalism, and Changing Structures of Accumulation, Transforming the Japan-India IT Relationship. He's written on the political economy of steel, auto, and IT industries, covering themes of global capitalism, economic development, innovations, inequality, and the international mobility of talent. So I think we have a lot to learn from Professor DaCosta.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle, for that introduction, and I certainly would like to also acknowledge Eriko for coordinating all the logistical dimensions of this lecture. And then also I'd like to thank Jeff Kingston, who is not here, and he was instrumental, of course, in introducing me to Temple University. Okay. I think I'll probably stand here so that I can see my slides. Now, there's a lot to be talked about, but I know I have 30 minutes or so I'll just get to the point very quickly. And before we get started, I should also say that you should never go to India for the first time. All right? So what I mean to say, well, I know some of you didn't quite get it, but never mind. Okay, this is a fairly recent kind of work that I've been doing. Let me just sort of preface this by saying that the first time I actually prepared this paper, I actually have almost a completed paper here. The paper was written for a conference in Geneva, organized by my colleague from Santiago, Chile, and it was really about the movement of wealthy people in the world economy. That was the original sort of topic. And actually the entire conference, it was a 3-day conference, but only 1 day with a very small group of us in the academic sort of side of things. And then 2 days was involving various other people. And that is essentially the entire industry associated with helping rich people move around the world, which means essentially lawyers, even the Prime Minister of St. Kitts Island was there. So what do you think he was doing? He was inviting rich people to come and invest in his country. So basically all tax haven types of places. So there was a kind of an interesting sort of a conference and a gathering. It gave me some interesting views about how the world economy works. So my paper, of course, was on India, and very much the world economy is also present in India, despite all the stories we hear about India being closed and such things. So it's really about wealth creation in India. But wealth and inequality, they go together. They are not quite, something that one is, both of them sort of, have some kind of a relationship between the two. In other words, if you have rising wealth and considerably sort of high rates of wealth creation, you're bound to have some other elements into it, which is essentially inequality. All right, so that's sort of the story, and I'll get to it in a few minutes. Oops, I knew I was doing something not right. I've got to point it to the computer?
No, you should try one more time.
There we go. All right, so Eriko had told me, well, most of the people who come for these talks at ICAS are interested mostly on East Asia. So maybe some background information on India is perhaps might be worth it. But I'm sorry to say I cannot give you any background information. You'll have to spend the entire night with me then. It's just to simply show you, okay, here is the country, very heterogeneous. we can get, when the Q&A time comes, we can discuss whatever things you might be thinking of at that time. But I just wanted to sort of give you a layout of the land and, I know it sounds very cliched to say it's a very complicated place, but let me tell you, it is a complicated place, right? Okay, so what's the argument in a nutshell? My objective is essentially to explain why Indian inequality is getting worse, right, under economic growth. So this is the sort of general sort of question. In other words, why is it getting worse when there is economic growth? Now, of course, I want to sort of qualify that by saying that it's not happening only in India. I come from the US, and the US is pretty much the same story, although the growth dimension is probably weaker, but the inequality is definitely getting worse. So that, just let me keep that in mind. Perhaps we can have comparative questions when we come back toward the end. Now, I want to provide a political economy explanation. My work is very interdisciplinary. Although I was trained as an economist, but then I moved to development studies, which is a very specific area of study regarding developing countries. Not necessarily always about policy, but there is also a lot of theoretical work that is done in that area. So as a political economist, then I provide both a political and an economic understanding of whatever I'm trying to explain or to work with. So in this case, I'm basically trying to provide the changing contextual dynamics. So here's the thing that I'm interested in. So I am not taking the approach of saying, well, these are the factors that are perhaps the most salient in explaining inequality. There are, and I'm aware of some of those things. Maybe they will show up in my presentation at some point. But really what I'm interested in sort of understanding is the context. One of the reasons why different societies do different things is mainly because of the contextual differences. And understanding that context is, I think, very, very important. And so I'm trying to provide that sort of understanding and at the same time explain the terrain of inequality. So increasing wealth and inequality based on two analytical categories, and I call them closed loop and open borders. Very simple concepts. Closed loop basically refers to changing state-business relationship. That's what it means, right? And of course, I want to show that how this closed loop is a kind of mechanism by which wealth is being generated in India, considerable wealth. And I'll qualify this further as I go along. But the main thing is that favors business and the agents of the state in a quid pro quo arrangement. Now, you may have heard of the phrase quid pro quo very, very many times lately. All right, so those who are familiar with the American politics should know that. Okay, so that's basically what it is. You scratch my back, I scratch your back kind of arrangement. And I'll come to that, all right? Then the open borders. So the second category, of course, is open borders. It refers to the global economy that is receptive to wealthy people. Receptive to wealthy people, and governments are complicit in encouraging capital and wealth flight from India and other countries. So this wealth flight or capital flight is also, it's an economic phenomenon, but which has many, many implications. And certainly I want to tie these two things together. And I say that basically what inequality arises because the privileged access of select business to the state, right? This wealth, and there is thus wealth creation because of that privileged access. This is not so different in some contexts, perhaps in the 1950s and 1960s Japan. And I can certainly point out to research that has sort of talked about this. The other, of course, is that when you create wealth, you generate what is known as black money. In India, this is a very common term. You say the word black money, everybody understands what it is. Perhaps not so much in Japan, but black money is essentially untaxed money. Untaxed wealth. That's what it is. So there is a lot of black money being generated in this particular access to the state by business and individuals, wealthy business and individuals. And there is a lot of flight of this wealth and income due to open borders. But the open borders are also made and created by other states. So you can think of, the tax havens. I don't know where the Japanese wealthy How they avoid paying taxes, I don't know. But there must be some that they get around with. In fact, there is actually a paper that I came across where Cayman Islands was a major recipient of various kinds of hedge funds out of Japan. So not all capital flight is illegal. It's illegal. But there's a lot of illegal as well. So this is where the blurriness comes in. In other words, what is white, what is black, we don't know. And some of it is mixed up, so we don't even know how much is what. So this is one of the problems, of course, of finding out exactly the amount of money. So I rely on the public press, what they are reporting. And obviously, they are subject to various kinds of defamation suits if they falsify data or something. So I trust their sources in some way, because they can otherwise get into trouble, right? So I've sort of read through the media reports about all of this, and there's a lot of that about. Anyway, so in the end, what you have is a closed-loop process of wealth creation, and you have open borders by which wealth leaves. And both of them have implications on inequality, and I'll come to that in a minute. So let's look at this. Now, this is a very simple sort of picture, as you can see, but this is actually a house belonging to one of the richest businesses in the world, the Ambani family. All right, you may have heard of this. There are two brothers. Sometimes they fight. The mother steps in, whatever it is. But they have this mansion of a place. It's 2/3 the floor size of, as you can see, the Palace of Versailles. And it's worth probably a cost about $1 billion. So this is just a residence, remember. Well, residence with offices, helipads, hospital, it's all in there, and it's in the city of Mumbai. So Mumbai, of course, is the most expensive city in India, and one of the most expensive cities in the world. Per square foot or per square meter, it's very, very expensive. So this is the sign of wealth, and the main thing I bring this up is because it is very, very stark and pronounced. Now let's look at some numbers here. This is the number of US dollar Indian billionaires, right, for 2018 or so. I have the data, 2018, right. So here you have 2012, 59, 63, 109, 124, 126, 136, 141. So $141 billion billionaires, basically. This number exceeds the number of billionaires in Japan. All right, so it's clearly there's some big disparity in some of these basic sort of statistics. In 2027, expected to have about 357 billionaires. So there is what we call a wealth-creating mechanism, whereby a very, very ultra-rich households and individuals are emerging from this economy. Globally, if you want to look at it, there are 13.9 million millionaires in 2000. That has increased to 46.8 million. This suggests, of course, that the global economy itself has been expanding considerably, creating a lot of rich within the world economy, all right? And India has had 34 dollar millionaires in 2000 to 759 in 2019. The collective wealth, now this is interesting, the collective wealth increased from 110 billion of these millionaires to 2.86 trillion. So the billions and trillions are like big numbers, right? Lots of zeros after them. And you can see that the numbers are actually increasing in India. So on the average of these sort of billionaires, if you will, there's 3.76 billion per millionaire. Now I know these sounds very confusing, billionaire, millionaire, dollar billionaires, but just forget about the number. Just think that there's a lot of wealth being created in the country, all right? And for comparative purposes, I have also US average is 4.0 billion, China 3.33, and Brazil 4.61. So Brazil actually has the highest average. And of course, Brazil also has one of the highest inequality, in fact, worse than India's, if you look at income distribution. Now, so the 100 wealthy Indians had a total asset of 417 billion, according to Crabtree. He wrote a very interesting book called The Billionaire Raj, very accessible book. He's in Singapore. He now teaches. He was actually a journalist from the Financial Times. Okay, so there's a lot of statistics. And then, of course, there are a lot of wealthy Indians in different countries. And I don't need to go into the details of that. We can discuss some of those. And Indians in the US, very, very visible. But they are of a different kind of Indian, in the sense that they are largely in the tech sector, innovators, IT, and venture capitalists, and so on. So on the average, the Indian household income in the United States is $89,000 versus the average for the average American, including the Indians, is $50,000. So ethnically speaking, of course, the Indians do very well in the United States. All right, so even there also you can see some differences. And of course, we are all familiar with the big American companies, particularly in the IT companies, such as Google, Microsoft. They're all headed by Indians. All right, so there are different sort of kinds of wealthy people in the different places, although it's not so clear cut, but we can see some of those differences, and we will sort of talk about it perhaps at some point. Now, given this background of wealth and wealth generation and very wealthy people, both in the world but also in India, here is basically what we see is, okay, what is the average sort of incomes in India? How does the rest of the India look like? All right, so India's annual per capita income is about $7,000 purchasing power parity. So purchasing power parity, which means you basically adjust it for the differences in costs. All right, since labor is cheap in India, you do that adjustment, and so it's about $7,000. If you want to take it as in current nominal dollars, which is simply the exchange rate, then it's only about $2,000. All right, so it's very low. So here I'm talking about $2,000 average. There I was talking about billions. I mean, if you just think about that, all right? And the poverty rate is 22%, 200 million people living less than 1.9 purchasing power parity per day. Okay? So that's basically is the World Bank kind of standard. Or India has its own sort of poverty line levels. So it's $0.3 per day for rural poverty line and $0.5 per day for urban poverty line. So if you think about this information, and then you think in terms of the billion-dollar millionaires that I've been talking about, clearly there is a huge polarization in terms of income. All right. So it's consistent with what others have already said. So, for example, this is from the World Inequality Report. It's available on the web by Piketty and Company. There's a whole bunch of economists who put out this report. And here also you can see that when it comes to India, although it's perhaps not as stark as China in terms of its growth rates for the high-income groups, nevertheless, India is not that different. So if you look at, say, very sensitive. Okay. So if you look at the top 10%, they increased, the income growth was 394% for India. It was 1,074% for China. But if you go further within the top 10% and break it down, you can see that they are growing the fastest. So look at, let's say, top 1%, top 0.1%, top 0.01, and top 0.001. You can see that the percentage. So in other words, the wealthy are becoming wealthier, which is, again, a fairly common story in a lot of places, but you can break it down and see this data. And of course, if you look at, say, the US, it's not as bad when compared to, say, India or China. It's not as bad. France is, of course, better. We all know that as well. I suppose that if Japan were here, then Japan would probably be somewhat closer or even better than France. All right? So here's India's Gini coefficient in terms of what it looks like. The other night, on my very first night in Tokyo, I went with a couple of colleagues and friends of mine, very old friends, and we had a big elaborate discussion about India's Gini coefficient as to what it is. Gini coefficient, as you know, measures inequality. The number varies from 0 to 1. And closer to 1 it is, the worse the income distribution. right? So in the Indian case, so we had an argument, sort of, a friendly argument, that basically he said that the Gini coefficient was about 0.4, and I said, no, it's good. So, but he was right in the sense that it was around 2010. The Gini coefficient was 0.4. But obviously, we know that the Gini coefficient has increased, at least based on this source provided by Piketty and company. So so in other words, even the formal analysis of income distribution shows that inequality is increasing in India. Of course, I have adopted a different sort of perspective and given you that the number of dollar billionaires is rising, and of course, there are lots of poor people in the country, so income polarization. So the story is consistent from these two different sort of angles. Now, then let's talk about how this wealth is being created. Now, I know you can't read everything here, but the main thing is that, okay, so what is the literature that I draw upon? The literature that I draw upon is basically that discusses rent-seeking activities. Rent-seeking activities, or what we call extractive activities. Extraction. Economic extraction is, okay, so if you have a mine, for example, you extract the mineral and you sell it, and that basically is, you make money out of it. And you make money really by not doing very much, except to get it out of the ground. All right, you can make money. And because it's mining, you often have certain types of access to the state. So in other words, it's a rent-generating type of activity, right? And we call it an extractive industry. But there could be other kinds of extractive sectors. Land could be an extractive sector, mines could be an extractive sector. But in the Indian case, there are many rent-rich sectors, and I'll sort of give you some examples of that, all right? So I do a discussion of this, and I don't want to do it here. Maybe we can discuss this later on. But there is a literature on this rent-seeking activity or extractive activities that allow me to approach the subject, right? But there's also the issue of fairness, because a lot of the rent-seeking activities rely on a very strange definition that, well, it's profits above what would have been possible under a free market condition. But what is free market condition? I don't know. I haven't seen too much of it, all right? Because most of these industries are oligopolistic, all right? So in other words, they make the prices. The price is not given. So it's a very different kind of, so I kind of don't dispense with that, and I don't deal with it so much as to talk really about a little bit about fairness, the issue of fairness. Why are these things not very favorable? It's mainly because of the issue of fairness, but that too is contested, since fairness at the individual level may mean compromising at the societal level. So it's a very messy concept here that I'm dealing with in terms of looking at extractive activities. But let's sort of move on and sort of try to see in reality what exactly is going on. So one of the things that India has undertaken is economic reforms, and that, of course, has led to more economic and what we would call commercial space or profit space. So, and I'll come to that, sort of showing you the trajectory from where it has come to where it has come to. And there in that transition, of course, the nature of the state-business relationship also has changed. So since some transparency due to market reforms, there are also greater opportunities. Now, this is something, of course, you hear very often. Well, markets are not free, and therefore there is all this corruption. And I don't use the term corruption either, and again, for some good reason, but let me not introduce that now. However, growth in profit spaces, and this is the argument that I'm making, is accompanied by growth in rent spaces. So in other words, as the profit spaces have increased because of the reforms, you also have increases in rent spaces, which means there are opportunities to make money on the side. That's basically what I'm saying. So just as you can make money by creating good products or being strategic about the market and so on, you can also make money in terms of what kind of contracts you get, the licensing system, and so on. So this is basically the one that is leading to the kind of wealth creation in this closed loop sort of fashion. Rents are profits above competitive profits, but then the problem is that if you have an oligopolistic situation, then you can actually have excess profits because you control the market. There are first-comer advantage, political manipulation of prices. These all fall under what we call essentially rents that are above profits. So corruption, but again, as I said, I hesitate to use the term corruption, although much of it is corruption, but not all rents, not all corruption is rents. And not all rents, at least legally, for example, patents. Now, patents, of course, is a form of rent. The government protects a firm for having a patent. But you're basically giving it the monopoly rights to make money on the argument that, well, it has invested money and therefore it should recoup its costs, and therefore it has the sort of monopoly sort of control over the market. So it's a form of rent, but I'm not dealing with that. It's part of the rent sort of seeking activity, except that this is done through investment and entrepreneurship kind of thing, all right? So I don't use the term corruption because it sort of mixes up with that. Because state handling out licenses in a non-transparent way for economic activities, such as mining, real estate, infrastructure, these are all what one author calls rent-thick sectors, all right? Rent-thick sectors, which generate black, unaccounted, untaxed money. So rent-thick sectors is, of course, one of those things where if you have the license, I mean, you basically have a huge opportunity to take money, make money. So let's say you get a liquor license. Now, liquor is one of those things. We all love to drink. All right, so the question, of course, is so obviously whoever has the license can do a lot of things, price gouging and so on, in order to have a huge market, and therefore make a lot of money. But it's the license, getting the license is what sort of creates that opportunity. And of course, in some convoluted way, in other words, you get the license not with some fair sort of competition, but rather you actually get it through somebody else. All right. Black money is also in real estate. Again, nothing unique to India, but there is black money in real estate. In fact, you want to buy a house in India, right? The seller will actually say, how much of it in black money? In other words, black is combined with white, all right? And then you can buy the property. Because everybody's got black money. This is all unaccounted, untaxed money. And real estate is a good place to put your money, assuming, of course, the market is appreciating. But real estate is a very, very high rent-thick sector. But there are some other interesting examples which may surprise you. So black money in real estate, but also in education. And you say, well, how is that possible? Well, in India, as you know, everybody is clamoring to get a degree. And there are lots of private universities. And these private universities, they give you preferences if you give them money. It's known as capitation fees. It's got a very nice sounding name to it. Capitation fees. So I guess they're recouping their capital in some way, I don't know. So you pay the money, so that's all black money. How are you going to say, well, you know, I gave X amount of money as capitation fees, unless it's black? Because then you have to declare it, and that would become unfair. And so there's a lot of black money in the private education system. So that's a major source of black money. And then there is another one, which is mixing subsidized kerosene with diesel. You wouldn't think of that, but there are, you know, Indian entrepreneurs are clever. So everybody has access to subsidized kerosene. It is part of the food distribution, if you will. Food distribution, you know, grain distribution kind of program. It's a public distribution system, that is PDS. But obviously entrepreneurs buy it off and then, you know, and mix it with diesel and make more money. So there are different ways by which, of course, these are the sort of three sort of major rent-thick sectors. But then there are many other sectors, as I mentioned, liquor, for example. Liquor license gives you a lot of sort of leeway to make a lot of money. So black money is reinvested in real estate, et cetera, or they take flight internationally. Now, this is where the open borders sort of comes in, and of course, money can flow. So let me then sort of give you a little bit background to the inequality question, but also in terms of, you know, what was there in India. Very quickly, During the colonial period, the colonial phase, this is a very stylized way of putting it, right? So here's the colonial phase. There were a few rich. Oops. There were a few rich during the colonial phase. And of course, the economy itself was constrained by the capitalist world economy, which is essentially the British merchants. All right? So the British merchants had the power, not the Indian merchants. The Indian merchants were subordinate to the British merchants. Okay, but there were a few rich, and there were local nawabs, as you know, the local sort of leaders and wealthy sort of who were essentially the tax collectors who became then wealthy. But that's a long detour to history, though I won't get into that. Then you have the post-independence period, roughly 1950 onward, 1947 Indian independence, 1950 onward, Nehru, et cetera, and you have very much a state-led phase, which is the import substitution industrialization phase. Now, here, of course, you do have a few more rich emerging, and the reason for that is because there were a lot of controls and regulations, obviously businesses found ways to circumvent those regulations and basically make money on the side in the sense that get, again, privileged access to the state for licenses or prevent your rivals getting those licenses, but working through the state. So this was the other. It wasn't a huge sort of thing, but there were obviously emerging wealthy businesses, during this particular phase. So few more rich. And then you have the reforms of 1991, well, actually in the 1980s, but the significant ones were in 1991 and thereafter. So the reforms begin. And the reforms obviously was trying to create a lot of transparency, and this is where, of course, the profit opportunities expanded considerably because of deregulation. You have many more rich with the reforms, and of course, even in the post-reform phase, which is now. So the reforms, since 1991, so it's been several decades now. And what you have then, of course, is that one can see that the inequality has been going up during these sort of three phases, all right? Again, there are more details behind this, but I'll just have to cut it short. So what is this then closed loop that I'm referring to? Okay, so you have state-led, patronage politics. So I don't know if you're familiar with the political economist, a very well-known political economist from Berkeley, Pranab Bardhan, who's from my state. He's at Berkeley, and he has written some very interesting things. And very early on, in 1984, he gave the Oxford lecture, and that's which came out as a slim little volume, but I think it was a very powerful book. And he talked about essentially how the Indian state resources were frittered away by sharing it with various dominant groups. So he takes a class analysis in all of this. He talks, and anyway, we can talk about this later. And for that, obviously, the government doled out licenses. You had to get permissions. There would be quotas in certain industries. So essentially created a kind of an artificial economics of scarcity, which then, of course, contributed to rent seeking. So Anne Kruger, who was at the World Bank, many of you know, was very critical of all this. But she always talked about rent seeking, rent seeking, rent seeking. But rent seeking is too, I think, simplistic way of looking at things. Because rent seeking suggests that, well, okay, there must be ways of getting rid of rent seeking. But it's not so easy. Because if you say rent seeking was due to regulations, then deregulation ought to solve the problem. But we find that in the deregulated period, rent seeking has become even worse. So what is involved here? So obviously, one has to understand the institutions that are at work. And that, I think, that's something that most economists don't pay too much attention to, all right, the institutions. So you have black money, and then, of course, you have the reforms, economic reforms, globalization. So India is becoming part of the world economy, attempting to become part of the world economy. It has to a great extent. And that entailed delicensing and, of course, new economic opportunities, but the rent space has also increased. So here are the rent-thick activities, real estate. Cement, why would you think of cement? Of course, construction industry, as you know, is everywhere. There's a lot of mafia-like activities in the construction industry, and Japan, no exception, all right? So cement, because housing was in shortage, so if you had a cement license, Yeah, you made lots of money, all right? So cement, mining, again, mining is a very traditional extractive activity. Even media, infrastructure. Now, infrastructure is, of course, these are big projects. There's oftentimes public-private partnerships, but there's a lot of money changing hands, okay? Ports, education, liquor. Now, there are also non-rent type of sectors, IT, pharmaceuticals, biotechnology. But even then, these could be subject to certain types of rent activities. Not all of them, not always. All right? So now what we have is this patronage politics over here. You have all kinds of developments. So there's patronage politics. So in other words, I help you, you help me kind of thing. There are career politicians. So in India, politicians become politicians because there's a lot of money to be made. So they're career politicians. Okay? Levels of corruption increased after the reforms, so lots of scams. And state incapacity became worse as business becomes more powerful. So here's the other sort of evolutionary dimension in the sense that for a long time it was the state that essentially called all the shots and the businesses sort of followed through. But obviously as businesses became more powerful, then the businesses began to influence the state, which is not that different actually. I've written a paper also on South Korea and the story is very similar. The jaebulls have become extremely powerful and that they have contaminated the political system very, very much because of their wealth. All right? And that also can be seen in the case of South Korea, more or less around the same time, although for slightly different reasons, because in India it's operating, Korea comes out of a military dictatorship versus India has always been open society. But in this openness, of course, corruption also increases considerably. And here, of course, what you have is that as the rent spaces increase, you have lots of fixers, lobbyists, subcontractors. There's a lot of graft, kickbacks, et cetera, et cetera. Entrepreneurs also become politicians. Here's the other interesting thing. So it's not good enough for entrepreneurs to influence the state. They become part of the state. So in other words, they actually stand for elections and win elections. So the nature of Indian democracy itself is actually a subject for discussion, but I'm not going to be doing that. There's a lot of leakage in state welfare programs. It's not that the state doesn't spend money on the poor, it does, but a lot of money just simply dissipates some other way. So entrepreneurs becoming politicians, and of course, entrepreneurs, businesses, to stay in the good books of the state in getting preferences, they must also contribute. So campaign funds, okay, and it's not just campaign funds, you pay off people. Economists have worked out in game theoretic terms, who is better off by paying whom. I mean, you can do those kind of theoretical things. In reality, of course, we know that money is changing hands. Political parties receive a lot of money, unaccounted money for their campaign sort of purposes, plus their own individual enrichment, all right? So all this is going on. And so what you have is a quid pro quo arrangement between such individuals and others, and the state and the businesses. Okay, so you have easy access to heavy borrowing. So this is another thing. So with reforms, then businesses become very confident, and with their confidence, they have access to greater resources from the banks. They increase borrowings on a very large scale with very little oversight on the part of the banks. They're simply using their influence. And as a result of which, of course, you have the non-performing loans or non-performing assets increase massively in India. So this is the other sort of fallout of this kind of a wealth creation mechanism, all right? So the ratio increases from 2.2 to 5.9 in one particular sort of period, all right? A lot of campaign contributions, and of course, increase in the members of parliament with criminal charges. So there are a lot of criminals who have become members of parliament. So in other words, politics, corruption, business, they've all you put it in a pot and mix them around, and you get something else. And that's basically what is going on in the case of India, especially when it comes to explaining certain types of wealth creation. So the open borders, of course, I don't need to say too much about it. The economy is open. There's capital and wealth flight. Of course, there's both legal and illicit money leaving. So Indian businesses are expanding abroad. There is capital flight, but that's fairly legit. It's not illegal as long as there are no legal rules against it, right? So that's fine. But there's a lot of black money, the untaxed money. Now, India, of course, was one of the early sort of pioneers of international financial sort of transfer, well before Western Union, right? Which is the Hawala system. The Hawala system was a very interesting mechanism for transferring money without the actual physical movement of the money itself. And this happened during the mercantile period. But we can talk about it. But this Hawala system has now been refined into other kinds of movements of money. Borrowed funds, but illegally siphoned out for personal or business. So this is one of the things that's going on. Swiss banks, as you know, a lot of secrecy, but now finally a lot of pressure from the governments, including the Indian government. They now have to disclose certain details. Not all of the details, but certain details. And we know, in fact, from anecdotal evidence, we know that there is a lot of Indian wealth sitting in Swiss banks, all right? There are also tax havens. And then there is the phenomenon of round tripping. So round tripping, of course, is a way of sort of funneling your black money and then basically making them white on the return. So you can think of, let's say, Mauritius. Mauritius is the largest investor in India. How is that possible? You have $500 and some billion entering Cayman Islands and about $500 something billion leaving Cayman Islands. So what are they going to Cayman for? Okay. And Cayman Islands is a tiny little place. And that's a huge amount of money that's coming in and going out. So these are places, of course, where taxes are very, very low, and businesses around the world, not just Indian businesses, American businesses, I'm sure there are a lot of Japanese businesses who report their profits somewhere else, and therefore do not pay taxes. So this is basically round tripping. In fact, Vijay Mallya, one of these characters, tycoons as they're often known, he put his money in the Mauritius and Cayman Islands, and now he's a fugitive in the UK. All right? He was a liquor baron. So if you had a Kingfisher beer, you would know. All right? He also had an airlines which went bust. So there was a lot of this kind of activity during a certain period of time, particularly since the reforms. And of course, these countries are also receptive hosts for wealthy people. You have money, you bring it in, you're welcome. All right? So there are obviously, I just pulled out a piece of data, although I have more information in the paper. 5 Indian origin business combined assets over 7 billion in Singapore. Okay? So there are a lot of wealthy people in wealthy countries, and there's a lot of wealth that is leaving India that are illegal. All right? I'm not saying that these people are illegal, but I'm just saying that money does flow out of the country. And this is the different ways by which other governments basically attract the wealthy. You bring money, you get citizenship, you get a passport, which allows you to then become fairly mobile. But also the wealthy like to live a certain lifestyle. And there are, by the way, lots of reports. Online you can get them. So for example, you have a report, an organization out of Mauritius, it's called Afrashia, and they produce wealth statistics around the world. Capgemini also produces wealth statistics. You have the Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse produces fantastic reports. In fact, I know the economist who does their research because he's a very well-known economist who has worked on inequality, Tony Shorrocks. All right? So obviously there's a lot of research going on wealth in terms of discussing, estimating wealth and the value of wealth and the wealth flows in the world. So you can see here that there are a lot of countries that are interested in getting the wealthy people. And of course, people who with that kind of money, yeah, they're supposed to generate some jobs, but that's about it. But it's very easy for the wealthy to move around, okay? So let me then give you a few more examples before we close shop. In the UK has been a fantastic sort of host to the Indian wealthy. Again, for various colonial and other reasons, but we also know there are Russian oligarchs sitting in London. So it's not So UK is a very strange kind of place for that kind of a thing, but India obviously has a certain connection with the United Kingdom, and a lot of the wealthy Indians have moved to the UK, or they have very good connections, they go back and forth, and so on. So you have 21 of the richest Asians were Indians in the UK. Jet Airways, which is an Indian Airlines, which is in trouble. The guy who basically was the CEO, he's in the UK with his assets 540 million. Hinduja family, 22 billion GBP, that is Great Britain pounds. So these are, now Hinduja family, of course, moved out of India a long time ago, but these are some of the allegations against these people. So Jet Airways transferred money, borrowed money on fictitious grounds. Hindujas, of course, they have been embroiled in this guns, weapons purchase sort of scandal for a long time. It hasn't quite gone away, but anyway, they have many other types of businesses, but they're not all that clean as they might seem to be. Vijay Malla, who I just gave you the example, he's awaiting extradition. Of course, he's not going to return for sure. Gupta is another person, another defense case, scandal, scam over here, Augusta Westland Defense. It's an Italian, German, I think. These are jewelers. They pillaged about 2 billion from the Punjab National Bank, meaning borrowed money, and then disappeared. All right. Similarly, Sandesera brothers in biotech. Now, this is supposed to be a non-rent seeking type of an industry. They have also been absconding with about 2 billion debts. So obviously, they have borrowed money. Let me just skip this. This is the richest 10 Indians. They have a slightly different profile. So you can see they are in these types of activities, software, venture capitalists, computer systems, and so on and so forth. All right, so it's a slightly different background, and they are present in the what we call the non-rent type of sectors. Okay. So what are the implications for inequality? The implications are many. I can't go into all of that. But the main thing is that this wealth-generating process, one, is that it is very unequal. It's unfair. It gives access to certain people. And then two, they don't pay the taxes on the wealth. All right? So when you don't pay the wealth when you don't pay the taxes on your wealth, then that tax revenue is lost to the state. And that tax revenue obviously has many opportunity costs. And that is the problem here. So obviously, money is being lost, investment money is being lost, and therefore, theoretically at least, employment creation, et cetera, all of those things are also being lost. So there's basically, that is the impact, and of course the unequal access in itself is part of the discussion of inequality, all right? Many of the wealthy people park their wealth abroad, and so obviously there's a lot of money leaving. So not only is investment money moving out, but also not paying taxes and then moving out. So that's a double whammy in some ways for let's say, investment discussion. So the India's estimate illicit outflows 213 billion over this period, but I think this is probably an underestimate because I think the other data shows something else. But nevertheless, it's large. Net, no tax revenues from black money, foregone investment with capital outflows, little employment growth made worse by capital flight. Now, there's also inequality in the receiving countries. They're the countries that receive the wealthy, all right? Okay, generally speaking, of course, it's a positive if the wealth comes into the already wealthy countries because they have welfare in the system, which sort of protects the people in some ways. But it's also negative if less welfare and there is inflationary pressure. I come from Seattle and I've seen it. It's obviously not just foreign capital coming in, but simply growth. With Amazon and various other foreign businesses that are contributing to the growth, basically drives real estate prices, and as a result of which people have to essentially vacate the places that they have been in. So this inflationary pressure. A few years ago in Singapore, normally a very peaceful place, well, or at least the lid is kept shut most of the time. Well, in Singapore, you've actually had protests, which you never think that Singapore would have. But the reason was simply that there were too many wealthy expats moving into Singapore and driving up prices. And that was one of the, so the government had to take some action. So these are things that are not unique to India, but they obviously have an impact, all right? So there's a lot of gentrification taking place. So gentrification is double-edged. On the one hand, yeah, slums disappear, but then where do the people who lived in the slums go? That's the question. And obviously, until and unless you provide for them in some way, then you're creating a more difficult situation. All right. Need to have, obviously, a global regulatory oversight. Now, there is a lot of discussion in terms of how to tackle global inequality and in what sort of way, right? So we have to rethink the growth-based social progress, and that would be part of the policy dimension on a big scale. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you for a brilliant presentation. It's fascinating, the information you presented. And of course, we have a million questions. The one point you made was that, if I understood you correctly, that in India now, perhaps some of these big companies are more powerful than the state and dominate the state, even though in theory India is a democracy. And of course, us Australians, we love India because you're a democracy. China, of course, is not a democracy, but the impression I have is that the state is more powerful than the state is in India. The state has, at least some degree of control over the big state-owned enterprises and private enterprises, and if they don't like what enterprises are doing, they whack the CEO in jail or kill him or so on. How do you feel about the quality of governance in India versus China, where you have in India sort of a low-quality democracy, and in China, arguably a high-quality authoritarian system? Okay.
Well, I mean, this is a question that has come up many, many times. Oftentimes people would sort of say, well, is democracy the problem in India because of the inability to govern? Governance has always been an issue, but again, it's mainly because of where the state comes from. In India, the state is a very sort of amorphous entity. There are parts of it that works really well. There are certain parts of it, and then there are other parts that don't. So even to talk about the state, we need to disaggregate the state. And to disaggregate the state means, okay, let's see, which areas is it good at? And you will see, even if you take a sort of an economic perspective, sector-wise kind of perspective, you will see that the state has actually done very, very well, let's say, on the information technology side. Now, but I should sort of say that there are many people who believe that the information technology sector has done well in spite of the government. That's the argument they would make. But I tend to differ. The information technology has arisen mainly because what the state did in the 1950s and 60s, which was essentially to create a technical education infrastructure, which now, obviously at that time there was no IT sector. It's only on hindsight we can see the connections. So from a governance point of view, the Indian government, of course, picked up that thread that, okay, here is a good opportunity. So later on, they created what are known as software technology parks. And software technology parks, in some way, they're very similar to the special economic zones, let's say, of China, all right? And they have done very, very well, the software technology parks. And of course, the Indian IT industry is thriving in some way, although, again, I have some certain reservations about that, and I'll be happy to recommend you some additional readings for you on that front. But if you look at that versus, let's say, if you look at the public distribution system, which is part of the state's kind of welfare sort of system, if you call it, it distributes subsidized grains and like kerosene and other things, cooking oil and so on, to people with certain means, right? Now that system, for a while, it has worked very well, but then there are certain deficiencies. One of the things that India does, of course, the government of India does, is that it gives you a minimum price to the seller of grains to the government, and then there is a maximum price. So it subsidizes both the buyer and seller which means there is a huge deficit on the government front. And furthermore, a lot of the grain that it buys off, it puts it in storage, massive storage. In fact, the Food Corporation of India, FCI, which is a state sector, is basically to manage this grain that is in storage. Well, a lot of the grain actually spoils, and they can't get it to the people who need it. So if you look at the statistics, you'll find that there is malnutrition in India. But the malnutrition is not because there is a food deficit. There's huge amounts of food rotting in the warehouses. It just can't be given, it can't be delivered to the people in need. So that is a governance issue. And there is obviously a lot of leakage as well. So now, this current administration, of course I have a lot to say about this administration, but I will keep that mostly to myself. This administration wants to be like China. So discipline the people kind of thing, because he wants to sort of browbeat everybody and get them to doing whatever he wants them to do. But India is not a place for that. I think one of the things about democracy is that it's not about only elections. True, we all agree on that, but also I think Indians have internalized their view about rights. So in China, you try to express your rights, you probably would be in trouble. In India, you can express your rights. And there are obviously avenues for doing so, even though this government has taken on a certain authoritarian sort of stance lately because of its other kinds of agendas, which is the kind of Hindutva ideology sort of trajectory, which is, again, it's a very interesting development and not a very good one, I would say. It's very counterproductive, but that's what we are living with. So in the case of the Indian governance, yes, in fact, this particular prime minister, he said, minimum government, maximum governance. Because I kind of changed that to minimum governance, maximum damage. Now, but the maximum damage refers to something else, all the, the lousy stuff about the ideology and stuff like that. But yes, you're right. Governance is very much needed in India. The question is the China model an option? No, it's not an option because the Indians will never follow that through. You cannot. You don't have that kind of state apparatus. The Chinese case is unique because the party and the state are one and the same thing. In India, that is not the case. But here's the other thing. This government is trying to be like China, and one of the ways by which it is trying to be like China, aside from the fact that it is creating a certain narrative, a historical narrative about India and its future and its place in the world, but also what it's doing, of course, is that it is controlling some big businesses. Controlling, again, through this mechanism, but not all big businesses, very selective ones. And the idea is that if you can control these big businesses, then you can pretty much get them to do. So it's a very regime-specific kind of a control, not the state business kind of a broader relationship. So yes, I think that there are governance issues, but I don't think the China model in any way is going to be applicable in India. It just cannot work. India is just too fragmented and diverse. In fact, we often call the Indian state to be a non-cohesive state, simply because the parts don't move in the same direction. And it's a federated system. So in a federated system, I mean, you have, in fact, different parties ruling at the state level versus at the federal level. So that's another sort of big sort of difference. So I don't think, yeah, the comparison also would be moot, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Anthony, for the fascinating lecture. As a person studying East Asian and Southeast Asian economic integration and development, I have to ask this. Mm-hmm. Probably you have come across this question some time in the past. But I'd like to hear your views on the dynamic upgrading implications of this closed-loop system, and especially in relation to the differences of the sector that you mentioned. For example, on one hand, you have a more domestic, maybe import substitutionary industry, like real estate and cement, of course. And then on the other, you have a more fragmented one, which is like the automotive electronics. And I think the effects of this closed loop system could be different, especially if you look at long-term development prospects. So I'd like to hear your views on how you think they're different, or are they the same? And second question is, are foreign invested corporations also part of it in the loop, or are they sort of outside the loop? So the two questions.
Okay,
Thank
the second question, of course, is certainly very interesting. Well, the first question is that, yeah, you're absolutely right that the closed loop kind of approach to wealth creation is going to be problematic for India to participate effectively in various global value chains. Because essentially, of course, you have to, basically you're taking away a certain kind of entrepreneurial energy away from the people, because you're now more interested in the political connections. So that's one. However, and I can revert back to John's question about China. In China, there's a whole lot of corruption too. So it's not like China is somehow, governance means nice and neat and clean. It isn't. There's huge amounts of money changing hands. I think the difference is that the quid pro quo approach is that, one, you take the money and then you deliver what you're supposed to deliver. In India, you take the money and you disappear. So that probably is the difference. But in terms of the levels of corruption and the direction of corruption and the situations that create those kinds of rent-seeking activities are very similar, except that, yes, the Chinese government, but that's the thing, the Chinese government can pretty much shoot you down, if it likes. In India, you generally cannot do it. I mean, it has to go through the court process and so on. Thank God for that, because we need that. But the point, of course, is that in the closed loop, what happens in terms of global participation? Obviously, it limits it. It limits it, and it makes a lot of activities unproductive activities, I should say. In other words, there isn't, the investment money, more money should be made available, but that sort of disappears because of this kind of closed loop sort of system. This, I think, is probably a real challenge. But this government has projected itself to be a clean government. In other words, basically running after all those people who took the money and ran away, and they want them to bring back, and they're demanding that the Swiss banks divulge names. So they are trying to do that because they have come on that platform. They won those elections on that platform. But saying one thing saying things is one thing, but actually getting it done is another. They haven't been able to bring fugitives back. They've brought some back through extradition treaties, but there's a whole lot of them. In fact, I have just to sort of, since I'm on that subject, so here are some fugitives, or real people. These are real people, right? So this guy, he's a jeweler. This guy is Vijay Mallya, He's not only got 1.3 billion absconding, plus 30 million in a mansion in France, plus euro 5 million as a super yacht. I mean, this is their kind of lifestyle. It's the global, the bold and the beautiful, well, the global rich and something, kind of thing. These guys are in the biotech, the two brothers. 704 million they're absconding with. They've borrowed money from banks, and this guy is, of course, Jatin Mehta. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that, so these are the new sort of, the wealthy, these are the old ones. So these are the old ones in the sense that she's a politician, this guy was a minister. But, again, and this is what, well, I think there would be, so there are some cultural elements to all of this as well, cultural, social. So, for example, a lot of money, was made, and she comes from a low caste, so there's a certain mobility as well, from a social point of view, becoming the chief minister of India's largest state. Of course, she's no longer the chief minister. Made a lot of money, but also distributed that money. So this is where the patronage comes in. You make the money, but you also give it away to your followers. That way you keep the voting sort of machine sort of going. So in India, you vote by vote blocks. They're known as vote blocks, voting blocks. Now, she was the chief minister of Tamil Nadu. In Tamil Nadu was one of the best examples we have of foreign direct investment. Do you think these foreign direct investments could have entered Tamil Nadu without paying her money? No. She enriched herself, but she also distributed that wealth to all her followers, which could run into tens of thousands. Has lavish wedding for their sons or daughters or whoever, and they invite thousands of people. It's a kind of, in Latin America, you actually had this system where you have festivals. And festivals, the landlords had festivals in order to distribute their quote-unquote ill-gotten wealth. So it's a kind of a patronage system. So here also, and this guy, of course, telecom minister, there was a scam, and the government lost about $40 billion because of insider information and other kinds of things. So these are the older sort of, wealthy sort of politicians, bureaucrats, and then, of course, you have the newer ones. But these older ones did not have the open borders as their exit. They could have, but they did not. Whereas these guys have the open borders as their exit. They disappear into the world. So when you come to then FDI and multinationals especially, I mean, there are some places, perhaps not today, I don't know, because I haven't, but certainly, during this period, which is, pretty much in the 2000 sort of, 8, 5, around that time, there was a lot of this kind of scams going on, and multinationals could not get in without contributing something. They had to, and certainly she was known very much for that. They wouldn't, I mean, we can't say it for a fact, but we all knew that Hyundai couldn't have made that investment in her state without actually receiving some payback, kind of thing. Yeah. So multinationals are caught up in it also. Of course, in general, in international business, you have to find intermediaries. I mean, that's for sure. But this is a slightly different kind of an intermediary where you have to pay off people to get things moving, whether it's license for land or water or whatever it is. So you have to sort of push people to get through. But also big chunks of money enter these and mainly because, again, the election system also demands such money. So the campaign funds is massive, which is also a problem in the United States, as you know. There's a lot of money entering the political system, and it has become necessary for politicians. So same thing in India. I mean, and India is even a bigger sort of place in terms of campaigning. I mean, poor sort of politicians, they have to, go behind a motorcycle and go village to village campaigning. I mean, it's a very hard job, but they also need money. And that's what plays a role, I think, in this closed loop kind of a system. So the foreign businesses are not involved in that kind of a way. The foreign businesses basically have to grease the wheels in order to get their investment taken care of.
Thank you very much. My name is Takagi. I'm studying about East Asia.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions is that Modi took office, and the day of the Congress administration, Indian people is more or less seeking equalities. But do you think Indians, the mentality has been changed after Modi took office? And because what I'm thinking about, China is trying to create a new type of capitalism where, the Communist Party to control. But same thing happened in the United States and India. That's my point of view.
Mm-hmm.
One is the plutocracy is, that the rich man is control everything.
Yeah.
It's the ideology and company, people, tax, and everything. And that's one type of the capitalism. And India is following this type. And probably globalization is to widen those kind of gap and increase more, this type of but system as well. But confine the Indians as far as the Modi's way of the thinking is very similar to kind of the, I don't say the plutocracy, but the according to the neoliberalism. How to think about it? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, good question. No, I mean, I think it's a little too early to make some serious sort of comments about the Modi administration today. However, I think we do see some sort of developments and some actions, I should say. The Modi government is, okay, so as I said, the Modi government, and Modi is the government, one might say. In fact, he actually does not have advisors. He makes pretty much all the decisions, and many of the big decisions actually comes from his supporting party, which is the RSS, which is the kind of the right-wing, fascist-like organization. All right. So they tell him what sort of policies, So, for example, India backed out of the RCEP. RCEP, as you know, is the the multilateral sort of free trade kind of agreement involving ASEAN and other countries in Asia, and India pulled out in the last minute. Now, it's true that it could create some negotiating space for the future, but it was basically the RSS, that is the fascist organization, that basically urged him not to sign the RCEP because they felt that India would lose out on the jobs front, the employment front. There's just too much competition from other countries unless certain safeguards were in place. So the RSS is often calling the shots, and Modi is the sort of mouthpiece through which it works. But the Modi government also has, because of the RSS, the Modi government also has another completely different agenda, which has, well, I wouldn't say which has nothing to do with the economy, it does, but to take it in a very different direction, and that is essentially to fall back on India's past and to resurrect it in some way. So in other words, if you take the post-independent India under Nehru, India, by its constitution, is a secular country. And by secularism, we simply mean that the state is equidistant from all religions. Right? So in other words, there's no religion per se within the state. But obviously, in reality, that is not the case. India is, spiritual and religious place. But in terms of how the state deals with the religion, it's supposed to be equidistant. That was pretty much Nehru's sort of stance. It's a very liberal kind of an idea. And it has sort of been there, although in the background there has always been a kind of some other sort of tension, because India as a society is not a liberal society. It's very, very illiberal. It's a very hierarchical society. So that is the problem. However, what Modi is now trying to do, of course, he is trying to create a kind of a civilization, and both China and India consider themselves as civilizational societies. So Modi wants to sort of further move the notion of Indian civilization upward in a certain way, and that is to negate certain things that presumably took India at the time of its independence on a certain trajectory, and he wants to move on to a different trajectory, and that is away from secularism. So he wants to make India as a largely a Hindu nation. When we all know that Hinduism is a very diffused form of a religion. It's never a centralized religion either, like Islam or Christianity for that matter. It's a very diffused form of religion. People practice it any way they want, anyway. And that's what goes on in everyday life. But what he's trying to do is to create this. So it's almost like a mirror image of, let's say, what Islam or Christianity might have been in terms of centralizing aspects of a religion. And this is what he wants to do. And this is what the RSS wants to do. And this is the ideological institution, which is the VHP, right? They want to do. So there are these three parts to this particular regime. So, and it's very much I would say, one that, yes, believes, like in China, got to have discipline and all of that, and that comes from the RSS. RSS is basically foot soldiers. They wear khaki shorts and they do drills, and they carry big sticks. Not that they beat up people, but it's really, you know, it's an organization. It's been there for a long time. And so that's the sort of, one outfit, and then of course you have the VHP, which is the ideological outfit. So they talk about the philosophy and all those dimensions of civilizations and the place of Hinduism in the larger world, whereas the BJP is the political front, the political party. It has to win elections in order to be, and they have. In the last election, he won by even a greater majority than people had anticipated. So obviously there's something going on, but it's purely a political game as far as I know when the BJP is concerned. But when it comes to the RSS and VHP, it's a slightly different game. But you're right that businesses have become powerful, except that the Modi administration, what he's trying to do, he's trying to create a divide within the big business. And he has selected certain big businesses to be his allies. And other businesses are kind of at arm's length. And I believe, although this is something to be further investigated, I believe that by creating this, he is likely to trying to have more control, not only over the businesses themselves, but also over the economy in some way. But yeah, he's, he does believe in growth, definitely. I mean, the Japanese are very interested in India. There's a Shinkansen being built in India with the help of the Japanese government. So all this is going on. So on the one hand, yeah, he wants to build the Indian economy, but he is also interested in building what we call a muscular India. So this is the difference. Previous governments didn't talk about muscular India. This guy's talking about muscular India. So in other words, make its presence in the world economy visible. And one of the ways by which you do it is to shore up the economy. Of course, right now the economy is in the doldrums. So obviously he doesn't have a clue because he doesn't have any advisors, any good advisors. Or whatever good advising there might have been, they have left. All right, so no good advisors. So that's one. But then the other, he wants to make India a muscular place by creating a completely different narrative about India itself. In other words, India is not a secular place. It has its own traditions and own history and own past. And in some ways, it's a kind of a way of negating, perhaps, but in a very sort of contradictory way, negating the West on the one hand, but it's really negating Pakistan, let's say. So there is a certain anti-Muslim kind of sentiment that runs in this regime in a very, very strong way. And so whatever they are doing is almost creating a mirror image of Pakistan. So we often say it's the Hindu Taliban is what we say. Right? So there are two different sort of directions in which India is going on with this Modi regime. It wants the economy, but it also wants to create a different narrative about India itself in a civilizational sense. And that, I think, is the counterproductive part, because it takes away energy from the other. And it leads to various other kinds of complications.
So I'm looking a lot at Southeast Asia and how technology is going to affect their economy in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how new technologies, automation, 3D printing, AI, blockchain, how that will affect India's economy. Is the Indian government trying to do anything to prepare for that, or is it going to take them by surprise?
Well, there are two things to consider. One, of course, is that a lot of these new technologies, some of them will definitely and have already entered India. In other words, if Indian businesses are part of the world economy, then they have to keep abreast with some of these technologies, especially for competitive purposes. So that, yes, so some select businesses will do that. But on the other hand, these technologies also cost money. And India is very, very cost conscious because of the low incomes, right? Low incomes of the people, so the question then becomes, the typical sort of economist story of capital versus labor kind of substitution. To what extent do you substitute, labor with capital? I mean, this is in the end capital. So that would be a question for individual businesses to deal with. I suspect that automation would be somewhat limited in India, at least for the foreseeable future. I actually have another presentation. I already gave that same presentation, but I'll be giving it again in Sendai day after tomorrow, and it's on the future of work in the automotive industry in India. So there I talk about the adoption rate of some of these technologies in different places, including in India. And it clearly shows that India is on the slow lane, and is bound to be on the slow lane because of the cost kinds of issues. But in certain other sectors where, let's say, a huge amount of investment will not be needed, then I suspect that they will introduce such technologies. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm not coming back soon.
I'll follow you. In the early part of your presentation, you spoke about how I think Canada, the US, Singapore are basically complicit in this whole game as they are offering passports to these
Right,
Indians.
right.
And you could probably add Australia to that same list too.
Absolutely. I have Australian information too.
And, you know, Canada, US, Australia, they're all members of the OECD. They're part of the Working Party on Anti-Corruption. They've signed up to the Anti-Corruption Convention, all these types of things, and they preach good governance. What do you think of these countries being complicit in this whole enterprise? It's
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is something that probably they won't see it as a form of corruption because, you know, they'll say, well, you know, we're simply, but obviously we know that it is a problem. I mean, and they don't recognize it as such. But I think that is the nature of global capitalism in the sense that I use the term mollycoddle. So mollycoddling business, you know, government's mollycoddle business, which means that they lay out the red carpet for them no matter where you go. So capital obviously is power in some ways, right? And it is power. So I think they do influence policies, they do influence governments, and governments in some way in their sort of thinking that feel that, yeah, if you get money in, the capital in, then that capital, and yes, some governments have that requirement that you have to invest and create a certain number of jobs. And so that's the arrangement. And so they are thinking an employment sort of point of view. So the people bring in money and do whatever they are required to do, but they are also moving in part because they want to change their lifestyle or they want to be in a different place. A place where, then there are many reasons as to why the wealthy move. I mean, that's another thing. And these reports that I suggested, they often will tell you that. So for example, they move because of better healthcare facilities. They move because of education, children's education. There's obviously a certain standard of life that they can live in those places. So those are some of the reasons why the wealthy move. And then, of course, there are very specific places like in Monaco and a few other kinds of places where, you know, you would have the lifestyle of the very wealthy, you know, sailing and, you know, I mean, there are these reports that document, you know, what do they purchase, and they purchase yachts, they purchase, buildings, mansions. Cars. I mean, there was the price of a car, I think 1960s, a German car, I think. I mean, that's one of the prized things among the wealthy. And it cost something like several $1 million. So the wealthy people, and these are the ultra-wealthy people. So I'm not talking about the people who come to get a visa, let's say. That is, they pay their way to get a visa. But these are the ultra-wealthy. And of course, governments are very interested in capturing their wealth. And then expecting that wealth will then lead to certain types of investments. Now, if you look at Switzerland, for example, now Switzerland is a tax haven, and also they are wealth managers. So they manage your wealth. So Switzerland is making money out of your money, but not really producing anything. If you really think about it, it's the rich who put their money, and the wealth managers deploy it wherever, and then make the wealthy earn money with their money, and of course, the managers themselves are being paid a salary. So it's a huge sort of, I wouldn't say it's a Ponzi scheme, but it's a huge financial sort of game that is going on in the world economy. And states, like the rich states, they are complicit. The other interesting thing is that, based on the question that you raise, is that the wealthy people themselves actually would prefer to live in a place where there is less inequality. So the rich like to be around other rich. Not, even though the money that they make often comes out by, exploiting the poor kind of thing, but yet they want to. So in fact, there's a study that shows that most of the wealthy people prefer that because they move to places where the inequality is less, not high. So governments are complicit, but that is the nature of capital. Capital is basically not nation-bound, so in principle. And in practice, it's not nation-bound. It goes to where you will generate the most wealth and returns, but also for safekeeping. Now, a lot of countries, for example, often have confiscations of various sorts because you back payment in taxes, all kinds of things. And so a lot of businesses from several countries are afraid. Even in India now, they're afraid. The businesses are being afraid because the Modi government is sort of saying that, well, if we get you, we're going to get you, kind of thing. So there is a fear among the businesses also. So then they will quit before anybody knows. In fact, before the demand was placed on Swiss banks to divulge the names of Indian depositors, not so much the amounts or anything, but just some kind of list of names, it was quite clear that those people had moved their money out already. So there's a lot of this kind of thing going on around the world. But where did the money from Swiss banks go to? They went to probably some other tax haven somewhere else. Bahamas, maybe, I don't know. So there is this kind of complicitness on the part of rich country states because it's quite clear that money is leaving developing countries. In fact, one of the studies that I quote and I use is it shows that there are, actually developing countries are net exporters of capital. Net, which means, you minus the money that comes in. So this is, of course, a kind of a commentary on the state of the world economy itself. That we talk about global inequality, and this, of course, contributes to global inequality even further. But that is the nature of capital. So obviously, at some level, then capital has to be in some way regulated and controlled. And there have been various suggestions over the years. Tobin tax, for example, was one such. For every international transaction, there should be some kind of a tax. But then you also have over the table and under the table. So how do you sort of track the under the table? Over the table, sure, you can track. But there's a lot of money flowing in other ways, and that's the most difficult part, where such good ideas may not be able to be implemented.
Anthony, thank you so much. This is a very interesting lecture.
Well, thank you.